Okay, today we're going to try to walk you guys through rebuilding and working on the Easy Adjust PTO clutch. This is the later version. This is brought out on most of the later 70s tractors and on forward until the electric PTO clutch. It's a pretty good, pretty fairly simple design, but a lot of people get intimidated by it. As you see, when we take the clutch apart, there's shims and washers and spacers, and they've got to be the right number, the right size, in the right order. And that could be part of the problem, people not getting their clutches adjusted and working correctly. So you need your parts manual and a parts diagram, and there is a service manual on this too. So we'll show you all that. First thing to do is take your hood off. Don't think you needed to know how to do that. And then the coolers are going to be different on for different years. How they're on, some are held on with screws and washers over here, and then some have bolts like this here. This is going to be a little difficult because I'm using a head cam. I don't have a camera person today. Okay, so you don't need to disconnect these hose clamps over here. If you're changing your hydraulic fluid and plan on doing it, now's the time. You can disconnect this and get this really right out of your way. Now the next thing we're going to be removing is this upper bracket tower support. And there's different ways to do this. You can get in here with the ratchet wrench and a wrench and do it. You can use a socket and a ratchet. And you can also use a wobble socket. And that's how we usually do them, wobble universal sockets. So this is the wobble sockets we use to remove a lot of stuff that's tricky. And the extension, these are Sunex. They work awesome, lifesavers in a lot of situations, but use whatever tool you got at your disposal. You don't have to take this all apart to get to this. It just, for the video, it's going to make the lighting and everything easier, and it does make it a little easier working around here. But at this point now, you could go to the next step and start pulling this apart. But we're going to get this out of the way for the video purposes. All right, hopefully you guys can see. I apologize again. Makes it a little tougher without a camera person, but all right. So we got this shield and tower out of the way. Like I said, it's not necessary. It makes it a little easier. You got room, but doing it just to help get some light for you guys. So there's going to be a pin here that you got to pull out to get this linkage off. Often there's a bushing in here that's got a lot of play in it. Can contribute to part of problems with PTOs. They get sloppy, the engagement in the rod. There's also, on this rod, underneath the tractor, there's a loop on most models that keep this rod kind of centered. Otherwise, this will really go to the right or left, and you'll break things, and the PTO won't work if that's either broken or not there. We've seen that often. Or this rod's not going through it. Somebody's monkeyed around with this, didn't put it back through the rod underneath. It's basically a guide is what it is. And sometimes these will pull right out, especially if the bushing's real bad. Other times they can fight a little bit. The reason we're taking this one apart, when you start it up and run it and shut it off, the pulley spins here. Like, well, you can see it right now. It spins super easy. I should be able to actually start it up and show you. That's not a big deal. And you see it's still spinning after the tractor's shut off. Those bearings are on their way out. Doesn't mean they're completely shot, but there should be a little resistance here. When bearings spin real free, there's no more grease left in them. And also, this is going to probably mean it's not set up correctly. The gap back here is what you go by. Isn't real bad, but it wobbles. So it's not just some forward and back motion, but there's actual wobble. Those bearings are no good. The next thing is you're going to take this 3/4 inch nut off here. And the important part is, as you take this off, keep everything in order so you know how everything came off. And saying that doesn't mean it was assembled right, because probably 60 to 70% of these we get in are assembled wrong. They're 20, 30, 40, 50 years old, and the PTOs have been messed with on most of them at some point in their life. And people don't always put them back together. Most of the time they don't put them back together the right way. But by keeping it in order, by chance if yours is correct, it makes life easier. And if it's incorrect, then it also might let you know if you've got a problem with your PTO. It could be because something was put in incorrectly, or the wrong size was used. So you got this big flat washer. This fan's actually in good shape. If your fan's missing blades, or they're real beat up, or they get brittle, replace them. Now's the time. But that one's in good shape. And we've got this spacer hub here. And then these are the spring washers. You can see them. They're domed. So this lever is changing the distance between everything. And then it's putting pressure and compressing these. And the force of these spring washers is what gives you the pressure of everything. Then this is your big adjustment nut. So this is where the adjustment gets done. We'll do that towards the end of the video. But it's basically a nut inside of a nut. And all the easy adjust clutches are not the same. Within each upgrade and year, model, generation, they've changed some things. They've changed spacers, they've changed thicknesses, they've changed the amount of things. So you really need to look at the manual that's correct for your tractor. And with that said, it doesn't mean someone hasn't changed and put a newer or older one on. Also, a lot of the older tractors that didn't have easy adjust clutches, a lot of guys have upgraded to easy adjust clutches. So you got to kind of find what's closest to the one you have and hope for the best if yours isn't factory original. There's this nut in here that's actually threaded that comes out through here, and this is where some of your adjustment comes from too. Well, most of your adjustment, I should say. When I said a nut inside of a nut, when you're adjusting, this slides in and out of here. And you got this big washer. A lot of times this will be worn. It is a spacer washer. This one's not too bad. It's got some wear marks, but it's actually not grooved. It's pretty common that these will wear, especially if the bearings are wearing. But this one's actually not all that bad a shape. It's actually pretty smooth across. It looks probably worse than it is on camera, but there's 3 sets of bearings on these. There's a bearing in this one, there's a bearing in this one, and there's a bearing in your pulley. Those are 3 bearings. These cams get offset. There's one side that's offset and one side that stays. So if yours are not offset on one side, then they're installed wrong and got to rotate 180 degrees. But right now we're pulling it apart. Note the way your fork comes off and make sure you put it back the right way from the way the book is. These people have put these in upside down numerous times and wonder why they don't work. Alright, so here's our cam, and here's the bearing in here. So now I'm just gonna start a new pile. And then you got your shifter fork, or engagement fork, whatever you want to call it. So if these bearings are real bad, they'll wear a groove in this shaft here, and then sometimes you can't even get these bearings off here. They'll either weld themselves to the shaft. The groove will be so bad you can't get them off. Sometimes you got to use a puller, but these are coming off all right. Again, I can feel that they're a little bit rough. I don't think there's much grease at all left in these. Then here is your pulley, and note there's a spacer in here, and it's shined up, so that means things are moving in here. And like we said, this thing was, you can see it, hopefully you can see it on camera. And when that was rocking, it was moving that bearing onto the spacer onto the other bearing, and they were wearing here, and probably took a couple thousandths off this thing, but we'll see. And then sometimes these pulleys don't come off real well because the bearings actually wore the shaft. This one's not all that bad, actually. You may get away with being able to just get a little bit of lube on there and pull it off equally. Yep, nice. Alright. So, yep, this is the bearing that was shot. That's spinning with no resistance. That means there's no grease in there. People will take a bearing and be, wow, that thing's good. No, no, it's not. It's good to blow up is what it is. It should spin easy, and there shouldn't be any inconsistency with the spinning and any roughness, but it shouldn't spin like that. It should have some resistance because the grease is in there. And as this is spinning, I can feel there's a rough spot or a worn spot. So there's your pulley, and the pulley itself actually looks in good shape. These can get worn and distorted, belts wearing, belts sticking, somebody hitting something with an implement and not shutting the PTO off, and the belt will actually start wearing the metal. Usually the belt will break too, but these will wear. And here's your friction disc. This is what does the driving. This disc's actually in really good shape. It's bonded here, glued here to this pulley. So we're not going to mess with that. There's a lot of life left on here. And then here's your hub that bolts to the flywheel, and your clutch rides on here. And this is going to wear. They do. That's what happens. But they'll wear quite a bit. This one's barely worn. I can run my fingernail over it, and the reason it's wearing uneven, again, is because that pulley and bearing was bad and it was walking. So it was engaging and putting pressure on one side more than the other, and it should be even and equal. This we'll just clean up, same thing, maybe some memory cloth, sandpaper, just to rough it up a little bit and get it cleaned up. And this next step is what's pretty important too, to see what you got going on here. But these are spring washers, wavy washers, and shims in here. And this also is putting pressure when everything's expanded and compressed. This is putting pressure also on the whole system. So basically those big washers have to overcome the force of these little washers, these spring washers. So those big cam washers we were talking about have to overcome this, so that disc pushes up against here enough and the friction disc rides on there. Why it's important that these are in the right order, the right number and right thickness, is because they have to, when compressed, they have to take up the gap in here and just leave just enough so your friction disc hits here. If there's too many in here, you can compress everything all you want, but this is gonna be too big of a space for this to ever hit the disc and drive off your flywheel, or off your hub, I guess is probably a better way to put it. So if there's too many, no matter what you do, you can put all the pressure you want in the world. These are only going to compress so much, and physically can only compress so much. This will be too far away from the disc. And again, if there's not enough, then you're going to have problems, and then this is going to walk back and forth, and it's not going to engage and disengage like it should. It's real important. That's why the thickness, the number, and the order everything's put together makes a huge difference. I'm going to guess these might be pretty close to the way they should be. I'm just thinking that the bearings probably were not replaced. Somebody looks like probably put a disc on this at one point. The discs won't wear a lot as long as they're adjusted right and you're not doing a lot of dumb things. You know, you start running firewood through a snowblower, this is what spins and gives. I mean, you might spin a belt or break a chain or something, but still, if that blower gets locked up, this engine is not going to slow down and stall. This old engine's got plenty of torque, and that's going to keep spinning. And if this is stopped, you're going to wear the disc out or wear this out. Same thing with your lawnmower. And if your blades don't go on instantly and stay at full speed, and then they're slowing down gradually, it's because this is, more than likely, this is spinning. So this is not adjusted right, and you're not getting enough pressure on here. So the only time this thing should really wear, pull that lever to go and engage your implement, and this grabs for a fraction of a second and it should lock right in. So this disc should last a long time. If they're wearing out, something's wrong and you're not adjusted right. This will still drive your implement at a very fast speed, but it'll be slipping and you won't really tell by the eye until you get a heavy load on it. I've seen people go in high grass and the engine doesn't bog down or anything, and the blades are slowing right down, and they just keep on mowing and it comes out of the grass and the blades pick right back up in speed. Well, this thing's spinning so fast and you do have some friction material here. Yeah, it's driving, but it's not driving like it should. And this is, that's spinning way faster than this is, and you're just wearing it. Same thing with blowing snow. If your blower and blowing snow, if your snowblower is set up right and it's not throwing snow pretty far, especially dry snow, you should get 15 to 30 feet throw with a single stage case blower, no problem. In dry snow, as long as you got it adjusted right and operating it right. If not, something's slipping. Chances are this is not adjusted right. Blabbing about people not operating things because we can make videos for 3 years and not cover it all. So this has got a big spacer. Then it's got a small spacer. Hopefully you can see all this. Then we've got a wavy washer. I don't know if you can see that, but that's what the spring washers, wavy washers. Got another one. And we got a spacer. So that's correct for most models. Then we should have 2 more wavy washers, which we do. And then a spacer. We do. Now the key is making sure these are the right thickness, these spacers. And we'll have to look at the book. And 2 more wavy washers. So that looks like it was put together correctly by memory, if it serves me correct. Got everything set up there. This shaft is in actually better shape than I thought it would be. Usually once those bearings start getting playing and people just run them forever and wear the heck out of the shaft because that bearing's walking on here. This is actually in pretty good shape, and we got a little bit more wear on one side than the other, but I'm not concerned. We'll clean that up. Alright, so one of the first things we always do, and we do this with any sealed bearings, doesn't matter if they're going on these garden tractors or heavy equipment, farm equipment, trucks, stationary equipment. Bearings today, I don't care what brand they are, you can get Timkins, SKFs, American, Chinese, it doesn't matter. 90% of them don't have enough grease in them. We always just open these up, even though they're sealed bearings, you can open them up. We put good grease in them and then close them back up. We do this with every single sealed bearing. So they're very easy to do. You can take an O-ring pick or whatever you got, and you just go underneath the lip seal here, and you pry up. And that's it. Now you look in there, hopefully you can see. There's grease in there, but there's not a lot. Right here, it's dry. These bearings are dry. Right here, it's dry. I'm sure if we'll flip it over and do the same thing, it's going to be dry in spots. And once they get moving, sure, they'll get coated and they'll last a while. Just pop these open and try not to damage the seals. And again, look, there's not much grease in there. Hopefully you can see that. It's dry here, it's dry here, it's dry here. Alright. Don't pay attention to the bucket. It says Napa grease, but it's not necessarily Napa grease. What we do is we'll put, instead of wasting the grease tubes, when you get done with our cordless grease gun, there's always a little bit of grease in there, and we'll just empty them off in here, put a lid on it, and it's plenty good grease. And we use a lot of Schaefer's grease and Redline grease, and they're both pretty expensive, anywhere from $10 to $20 a tube of grease. So if you can save some, I'll just get that pushed in there nice. You don't have to go crazy. You don't need to do the palm of the hand method because there is already grease in here. Let's apply pressure as you're putting the grease in, so it just gets packed down in between. I'm not going to go through all three of them with you. Just wanted to show you the basic. And then just take your seals. Make sure you're right side down. And you just press them in there. Just walk them around with your finger. That's it. You can see it push some grease out this side. And then this is going to force the rest of it in between the bearings. Just make sure it's in there and doing its job to keep the dust out and the grease in. Again, when you take them off, just be careful not to damage the seals. And now this bearing will last the customer much longer. Okay, so now we're going to show you how to knock out these bearings. You want to clean these things up here pretty good. That way none of the grime and stuff falls in when you're taking the bearings, putting new ones in. They can only go one way. I'm not sure if you can see that, but this outer lip retains the bearings on this side. On this side the bearing protrudes. This is the side the bearing has to come out. You can't knock it through this outer lip. So the bearing has to get driven down. Sometimes they'll pop out by hand, not a big deal. And other times they fight. And if they do, usually they're not in there too bad. You can put them in a vise or whatever. If you put them in a vise, just make sure the bearing has clearance to drop and you're not driving the bearing down on the vise. And you want to be mindful that you don't break these ears or crack any of this. You can take a piece of pipe or a big socket and drive on the race if they're in there hard. If not, usually you can get away with just tapping them. And they come right out. Make sure this lip is clean because the bearing has to sit flush in there. If you need to take a pick or a screwdriver to get any grime out of there, do it. Pretty straightforward. And then take your new packed bearing. You can spray something in there, it doesn't really matter what, just to kind of protect it. So if you ever have to pull these out again, they come out nice and easy. WD-40, penetrating oil, a little bit of grease, anything. Motor oil. Sometimes these drop right in like that. If they don't drop in, you can gently persuade them with the hammer, but the key is with that, putting them in anyway. You want them to go in flat and level. Is if they go in at an angle, they'll jam up and they're not going to go in straight and you'll damage them and they'll fight you. So you want to make sure this bearing is sitting as flat as can be from side to side. And then you can either tap them in with the hammer if you need to, or if they fight a little bit, but make sure your bearing is straight from side to side here, that this clearance is pretty close. Obviously you're not going to get it perfect, but you want it to be close, that all the way around. Then you can put it in a vise and then just press it in if you need to, or a small press. Usually though, these will go in by hand or with a hammer tapping them. These bearings are the same both sides, so it doesn't matter. You can put the bearing itself in anyway. So those were the easy. This is the bearing that I think is, well, I know it's shot. It had all the play in the shaft, and you can just watch this thing spin around and spin around and spin around. I mean, that's very little effort to make it do that. Alright, so again, we cleaned this up already. Your bearing's only going to be able to go in from one way. This bearing gets knocked out through this side. As you can see, this side, it can't come out. All it's showing is the seal. It's retained by this. So this bearing gets dropped down away from the friction disc. Again, make sure whatever you're hitting it against, you've got enough clearance for the bearing to drop and you're not hitting it on the jaws of the vise or whatever you're using. And we'll see how this one pops out. This one's going to drop right out too. Not a big deal. If they fight, you might have to use a block of wood or a big socket or something. You just want to be mindful not to get any grease on this face. Brake clean's fine, but you don't want any grease on your friction disc there. Again, this lip, this face has to be clean so the bearing sits in there flat. A little bit of something in there, just ease the installation and keep the rust away. You just, again, be mindful not to get it on the bottom where the clutch disc is. You want this bearing again to start as even and level as you can from all four sides. And if you go hit them in with a hammer, better to do it with a softer faced hammer, dead blow. But you know, hit it 12, 6, then 3 and 9. You don't want to hit all kind of crazy things. You want to work them evenly, and then you can go around if you need to. Now that it's down in there, you can do that. And that's it. The bearings are installed. That part's simple. Just make sure it's even on the back side. She's all the way down. So now I'm going to try spinning it like we were before. And you can watch. It doesn't spin nearly as much. Actually, quite a bit more force to do it. Before on the tractor, she was just spinning and spinning and spinning. The housing looked good. We inspected that to make sure we weren't getting any wobble from wear in the housing and whatnot. The wear was actually coming from the bearings being worn. You can get wear in the housing or the outer races or the inner races of the shaft, but the wear was from the bearings. Okay, so a couple things while we got this on the bench I wanted to show you. A few things you want to be mindful. These edges of this fork should be rounded. They should not be squared. Because this fork pivots, and it pivots in these cams. Okay, and when it's pivoting in these forks, so you want it's rounded, it moves, so you want that to be rounded. You want this fork end to be rounded a little bit, not horrible, but definitely a little bit. And these here are kind of straight and square, but this is what's moving, so that's where you want that to be rounded on the edges. Another thing, these need to be parallel across here. They can't be bent. They need to be parallel this way as well. Just something to keep in mind. You want to make sure you got a good bushing in here. If not, replace it. These, you don't want them too egged out. These are getting a little bit worn, but not horrible. They'll tend to wear in the corners, and you don't want them to wear in the corners too much, or this gap in here to get opened up and worn. But these should be absolutely fine. They got a lot of life in them. They're not brand new, but they definitely got life in them. And then again, we're going to clean this friction disc up real quick with some brake clean, a little bit of sandpaper, emery cloth, just to rough it up a little bit. You want to get all grease and oil and contaminants off of there. You want this all cleaned up in here too, where your belt rides. You don't need to smooth it out too much, but you want it nice and clean. Alright, so a few things I wanted to point out. Here's that clutch linkage rod. Here's this piece I was talking about that guides this rod that goes into your forks. Your forks here, here's that bushing I just showed you. So here's that loop. This rod has to be in that loop, and that loop shouldn't be broken or not there, because this rod will go back and forth. It'll flop all over the place. It'll screw up your forks, your engagement, everything. So you want to make sure this rod is riding through this guide. Alright, and here's the breakdown for this particular year. The later series 448 late model. So each year, some of these components can be different, and they also can be different thicknesses. So that's why you need the parts breakdown for your particular year. It's very important. And it'll show you on the parts breakdown the size, the spacer thickness, how many are in there, etc. So if you go, this is a service manual for this clutch, and if you go here, just to show you, it's going to be slightly different than here, and this because this is for a different year. So if you look at this, this has got behind the fork, you got your bearing, and this is showing 3 spacers here. And this says, in this instruction repair manual, it says 3 or 4 at 0.05, or 1 at 0.020, or 1 at 0.10, whichever is present. Well, yes or no, because if somebody assembled it wrong or put the wrong kit in it, you're up the creek. So you're better off going to your year parts book. This year parts book's only showing one spacer in here, and that's number 19, and that's showing at 0.100. And these change through here just to give you an idea. So sometimes the spacers in front and behind here, these heavier ones, are going to show being different. The point is, get the breakdown for your particular year clutch. Okay, now we're going to go back to assembly. Alright, we already went through and took the calipers and mic'd out our spacers, make sure they were the right size. We inspected all the parts and everything, spec'd out and checked good. So it's important you do that. If you are this far, we do recommend just replacing these spacers and wavy washers. So these are actually okay, and they've got a lot of wave left to them. And then this wasn't the issue. The engagement and spring pressure and stuff was fine. And these spec'd out fine, so they're not worn. They're still straight. So we're going to reuse them. This I don't think was the original set for sure. I think somebody's been in here. I just don't know if the bearings were cheap bearings. They didn't grease them, didn't replace them. I'm not sure. Either way, everything's spec'd out, so we're going to reuse everything, and all we do is replace the bearings. But if you're going this far, I'd order a shim kit for these with the wavy washers and the shims in there at the very least. And those big clam washers, spring washers, those are good to replace sometimes too, depending on how much wear you got. But we're going to go back and start putting everything together. We've got it all kind of laid out how it needs to go. But we're going to follow our procedure here because that's the best thing to do. If you notice, we cleaned this up here. So it's all cleaned up. It really didn't take much. The shaft wasn't really scored very bad or grooved out. Neither was this, just slight, but cleaned up. We didn't take it on a lathe or anything. We're not going to show you the unrecommended, unsafe procedure of running the engine at an idle and lightly applying a piece of sandpaper to it, because it's dangerous. You can lose a finger, lose an eye. Definitely not the procedure we'd recommend you doing. Just do it safe some way. You could just take a piece of sandpaper with the engine sitting here and idle, or I mean not idle, and the engine's off, and just go back and forth and clean it up. Or a die grinder with a roll lock or a Scotch-Brite pad. Those are good safe ways to do it. Alright, now we're going to go through our assembly here. Let's see what we can get done. I'm sorry about the angle again. I don't have a camera person right now, so we're starting down here. But we already got our hub on there. We didn't mess with that. So it's showing 2 number 7s, and on here the number 7s are the spring washers. So that's what we're going to do first. And we took apart and cleaned all these off. You want to make sure these are clean. A couple different reasons. A, if they got stuff on there, it'll affect the clearance and tolerance in there. B, if there's grease and stuff on here, it'll get hot and it could melt and get onto your surface and your friction disc and affect the way it works. Alright, so we're going to have 2 wavy washers here. It's 2 number 7s. And if you notice, they've got the waves in them. And I try to put the high points against each other, if that makes sense. Instead of having them fall in to each other like that, what I do is I try to put them against each other. Got our 2 wavy washers. So I want one of these, which is 0.05. And then again, we're going to go with 2 wavy washers. So this is where we are now, right here. Again, I put them on with their high spots. And then I want one of those 0.05 spacers. And then we got 2 wavy washers left. So the last 2 wavy washers go on. And now we need to pay attention. We've got 2 spacers left. There's one thick and one thin. So the thin one goes up against the wavy washers like it has been. Then the thick one goes. Alright. So 2 wavy washers, thin shim, 2 wavy washers, thin shim, 2 wavy washers, thin and thick shim for this particular year. And we've got our clutch disc here. So all we did was just took a little bit of sandpaper emery cloth by hand, roughed it up a little bit so it's got a nice rough surface to grab onto there. Now when you're inspecting these, if these are glazed over, they're no good. If you're able to get the glaze off with some sandpaper and keep the surface flat, so you put the sandpaper down and rub this back and forth on a perfectly flat table or countertop or something and get the glazing off, it'll be fine. Same thing, you don't want the hub here over glazed. Usually a little emery cloth or sandpaper will clean up that hub. Okay, so now we're on this step. The clutch material faces the flywheel and we're up against those washers. So now you can see how this works a little bit. When you're pushing the spring, those wavy washers are preloading it. What the wavy washers keep this off of here when your PTO is not engaged. So it's like a preload. And then when you engage it, those big clamshell washer cam things put more pressure than these washers can hold and let that disc grab the front of the engine. That's why it's important that you use the right amount and the right thickness shims and washers in the back, so this can actually reach the flywheel surface. Well, we'll call it a flywheel surface, but it's really just a hub on the front of the flywheel. But and then next, we've got one of these thick spacers, and that spaces between the 2 bearings. You got the bearing here and then the bearing on the forks. Okay, so next we're here. We got the bearings already installed, our new bearing. And this is going to be a little hard, I think, to show you, but we're going to do our best here. So the back bearing holder, the cam here, these have to be, if you look at this side, it's lined up. This side's offset. That's what you want. If you take this and spin this around, this side's lined up, this side's lined up. So that side's lined up and that side's lined up. That is incorrect. It won't function. These have to be, when they're mating to each other, one side has to be offset. So what you do is you take one, you spin it 180 degrees. Again, you mate the flanges up to each other. And then now we've got one side that's offset, one side that's not, and that's what this shifter fork does, and that's how it applies the pressure. Now what you want is the one in the back, the bearing holder in the back, when it's offset, the side that's offset, you want the back one lower than the front one. So again, this side is lined up, this side is offset, this one is your rear one. The back is lower, the front is higher. So at this point, we don't need to, and since we cleaned this up, but right before this step, it doesn't hurt to put a little bit of spray on the shaft here. It doesn't hurt to put a little something on there, plus it'll keep the rust and stuff off of there. Because I didn't want to get any grease on the mating surface of the flywheel and the friction disc. This side's off like it should be. The lower side is the one you want in the back. Sits in there nice. And then you're going to take the front and make sure you didn't rotate it. Slide the front on partially. And then now we've got our shifter fork here. Here's this bushing in here that's plastic. Even though it's plastic, I recommend putting a little grease or lube in there. It makes inserting it easier, but it also makes operation easier. You'll get a lot of dirt and dust and grime in here, and these do wear out quite frequently. And the shifter forks can go on backwards, and they do often actually. But the way you want it is you want the bend of the fork forward, facing forward. So the fork is going to bend forward. Another way to tell on most models too is that this bushing is rolled, the bushing holder is rolled forward. So you want the bushing facing forward not back. Not like this. You don't want the bend backwards, you want it like this. So the bushing is on the front side and the bend is forward. What you do is just simply put this between the forks. But you just insert it between the two cam plates, and then you can just take this shaft, usually the rod, and just it'll usually work right in there. But most of the time, if they're not beat up and the bushing is in decent shape, they'll slide in with just slight resistance. Install your new cotter pin in here. Okay, so we got that. The bearings are all in there, the cam's in there, the fork's in there. And next we have this big thick spacer here. Just flip it over, and then this side will ride against the bearing this time. And again, put a little grease or a little lube on here is absolutely fine to keep the rust on there and a little less friction on there, and that rides in there. And now we go to our nut and our adjuster nut. Okay, these definitely clean up a little bit because inside here needs to be smooth and clean and lubed up, because this guy rides in there, slides back and forth inside that big adjusting nut. So the cleaner and the smoother he is, the better everything is going to adjust and work. Same thing with this round spot. You want this clean and smooth and lubed up because everything's still got to slide. And then the threads, of course, keep some kind of lube or protection on them. I'll run that back and forth a few times. Make sure it's nice and smooth. See that moving? Like this. The hub facing out. Alright, before you descend this nut in, you want to make sure this washer here is riding up on this little bit of hub that's still sticking out. It's imperative that that's on there and it's sitting on the hub and it's straight and where it belongs. And then just take this and just lightly get it on there so it gets up against that washer. And that's where we're going to stop right now. And your next steps, you're going to need an 1 3/4 wrench or adjustable wrench or whatever you got that can turn this, and preferably a torque wrench. It really should be torqued, and a big set of feeler gauges. You can get by with other tools. It'll show you how to do it, and you use what you got to make it happen. You go out to the service truck, and so you need a set of feeler gauges. Use what you got. These big ones will work handy. I'll bring this set in too. And then we need a torque wrench and a 1 3/4 wrench. Oh, let's see. Got our torque wrench, and we need a 1 3/4. Should be right out here. Here it is. I'll take the angle wrench. And while we're at it, let's take service wrench. Okay, so the next step's a little specific. We're going to take this spacer and then these two big washers, spring washers, and then you go next. What we're going to do now is I just send this in. Okay, so the next step is I sent this in just to seat everything. Just turn it, you don't have to go crazy. Just turn it enough to where you're turning the flywheel. Then you're going to want to back it off. Okay, so that stuff's seated. Back it off until you get a lip with this hub coming out. Again, this washer in the back, you want to make sure stays on that back hub. So hopefully you can see this hub is now sticking out a little bit. That washer's still seated on the hub behind it. And everything's seated because we just tightened it up. But you want to get this washer out here. Then we're going to take our washers, our clamshell spring washers, whatever you want to call them. They're going to ride, well, the one's going to ride on that back hub. Alright, so you see how that is? It's riding on that hub that's sticking out. And then take this one And then this is important, this can go both ways, and there's a right and a wrong way. The bigger hub, the bigger diameter hub, goes towards the back where this washer here sits in. Alright, this is wrong. That's right. Now you want to keep all this centered. So you should be able to push side to side, up and down on these clamshells. They should not move. They should be sitting on the two hubs, sitting on that back hub and sitting on the front hub. Okay, so this next part can be slightly tricky, but there's a small hub sitting on this piece that we just put on, and this fan rides on that small ridge there. There's a small ridge. The fan can go on backwards too, and you don't want to do that. The correct way is the blades are coming out facing towards you, facing forward, if that makes sense, and the fan is actually offset a little bit, so the smaller lip goes on the front, the bigger lip, the deeper lip goes in the back, and it should rest there. Again, make sure everything in the back has stayed in place. That big washer, I know it's tough to see, but the big washer behind the nut, and then the two clamshell washers are sitting where they need to be, and they can't move around. Then we've got this big washer. Again, we just painted it, not a new one. The nut is new. Don't need to use a new one, but we do. They're fine. This one's grade 8, but that's only because that's all we stock and use grade 8. The hardware is pretty close to being the same price. Alright, now just kind of get that on there, snug it up, and then we're going to take a look from the side, and maybe it'll make some more sense. This nut will get sucked in there more. What we're going to do is you're going to measure this gap that's back here. Hopefully you can see that. So the gap between this friction disc and the flywheel hub, right here. That's what we're measuring on both sides. We're going to use our feeler gauges. We got this big proto set. Works for a lot of stuff we do on some of the bigger equipment. They're handy to have for a lot of stuff. Some 0.002 to 0.007 thousandths. I kind of like to go a little bit more with them, but the key is basically so it's not, the disc isn't touching that flywheel hub when it's not engaged. That's kind of the main thing here you're looking for. But right now there's, you can see that, and this is just sloppy as heck in there. You can fit a quarter in there. And this is checked when your lever is all the way back towards you, disengaged. Okay, so we want to get it adjusted so this has some resistance and drag on it, and I'll go around and show you how to do that from the front again. And the reason I like these long ones is that it goes all the way across the disc on both sides, and you want the same clearance on both sides. Now that this bearing was worn on the old one, the disc was probably wearing a little crooked, and to get an exact equal amount on both sides is probably not realistic. The disc was not real bad when we checked it, but it was off, and we're talking thousandths here. So, but the key here is to make sure this is not touching the flywheel when the tractor is running and the PTO is disengaged, and that it engages with some resistance but not overly resistant, because you'll bend and break the linkage in the rod. And how we're going to adjust this is you can use an angle wrench. They work pretty good, but not everybody's got an 1 3/4 angle wrench kicking around. Okay, so you can use whatever you got. You can use that big angle wrench or a big wrench, an adjustable wrench, or a pair of channel locks if you have to grab this big nut in the back. That's 1 3/4. I know service wrenches we use work great. This is an 1 3/4 Proto. Case Ingersoll had a special wrench they sold, and what you do is you get the big 1 3/4 on that nut in the back, then your 3/4 inch socket or wrench or whatever you're doing on the nut in the front, and you work these together. That way everything stay where they need to be and nothing comes apart. And as we're turning these nuts in, we're pushing that pulley backwards towards our friction disc and closing up that gap. Again, you want to make sure your PTO is disengaged right now when you're doing this. You just keep tightening that one and then tightening this one a few turns. Tighten the big one and then tighten this one a few turns. When you want to stop is when you can't spin this pulley by hand anymore, and it's hitting this hub in the back. So as you're turning the back one, this front one's kind of loosening to some degree. The space is changing, the gap is. Alright, so right now, you probably can't see, but I've got some resistance on this friction disc. It's hitting back here. I couldn't get a feeler gauge between there if I wanted to right now. There's no clearance. Alright, so now what we do is take this big nut, and then now we're going to back it off a few turns. With that, let's see. Yep, now it spins. Let's take the feeler gauge and check that out now. This is just the gap here where we want to get. See that? But you want to send your gauge all the way through if you got a big one, or go around both sides and check. And there is some resistance here. It's way better than it was, but it probably can get tightened up a hair. Big nut, tighten it up just a little bit. Right now, the feeler gauge has more resistance on it. And you don't want to go too much without tightening the front because they got to work together. So now, just put your 3/4 in the fan. I'm going to pull this out and see if I can spin this. Now the pulley spins by hand pretty good. I think it might be a hair much. Back it off a hair. Yeah, that's better. And it goes all the way through. You can do it on the bottom if you want. You can do all 4 sides with the whole. Okay, so now that we set our gap back here with the feeler gauges, normally what we'll actually do is set the gap to about 10 thousandths, because when you torque this up and tighten it up, the clearances tend to change. It's just kind of the nature of the beast. Not every time, but usually 10 thousandths, if it stays open, is fine too. So that's kind of usually what we do. We'll set it at about 10 thousandths, but I wanted to show you what the book said and show you how to do it that way. And you can do it either way and start it, that's fine. Now what you're going to do is get your torque wrench and set it to 45 pounds. And you're going to put your 3/4 inch there, and then you're going to want to hold that big adjusting nut in the back. But if you can hold it with whatever you got. And then you'll feel this starting to grab, and it's going to want to turn the flywheel and the wrenches and everything. You can see that or not, but it wants to turn the whole thing. And there we are. That's 45 pounds. So at this point, you want to spin this, make sure it's still free. Engage your clutch. And you want some resistance, some force to do it, but not a ton. You don't want it to feel like it's going to break. And you want these distinctive clicks. It feels alright, but you need that distinctive clicks, but you want to make sure you get that last one. There's the handle, and that's what it's doing. It's camming over, so you got one click is going to open and then lock it. And again, right here, spins. Engage, you can't do nothing. I'm going to take my feeler gauge. I got one of these nifty 90 degrees. It works fine too, whatever works. It fits on this side. I'll go over here. You want to be roughly 180 degrees opposite from each other. So that one's in there like that. Alright, so we set this at about 10 thousandths, and we just checked that with an 8. So it's a little bit off, but it'll be fine. It'll work absolutely fine. But you can do whatever you want. And make sure you cycle your lever a few times though. That's how you do it. To do it without taking everything off here when we've got a video. Not necessarily the recommended way to adjust it, but it'll get you out of a bind if you're mowing your lawn or snow blowing and you need to finish and you can't take all this apart right now, and you can order your parts and rebuild it, next free time you get. We've got a video showing you how you do that with the easy clutch without dismantling the whole tractor. Basically field adjustment. We appreciate all the feedback and the comments we've been getting and the messages, and it's been great. So we'll keep on making these videos and let us know what you like and what we can improve on and what you might want to see in videos. You can find us on Instagram and Facebook, also at Case Ingersoll Tractors Northeast. Just remember, guys, be safe no matter what you're doing. Don't lose your patience. This stuff's basic. All mechanics are basic. minimal skill level guys are learning, and don't get frustrated. Remember, man built it, man can fix it. There's a solution to every problem.